Before sunrise, when the world is still blue and cold, a small fire breathes inside a low shelter. The flames are not large. Wood is too valuable to waste. A few sticks crackle softly, and above them a clay pot darkened by years of smoke leans into the heat. Beside the fire, hands move with the quiet certainty of memory. They are tired hands, hands that have planted, carried water, gathered fuel, lifted children, buried seeds, and waited through seasons when the earth gave little back. On the ground rests a small pile of dry corn. Not a feast, not abundance, just enough to be counted. Nearby, a child watches as an older woman breaks the kernels loose and begins to crush them against stone. The sound is slow and rough. Stone against grain, morning against hunger. There is also a handful of beans, hard as pebbles, saved carefully from a previous harvest. And in the warm ash, half covered like something sleeping, lies a piece of squash. Its skin is blackening, its flesh is softening, sweetness is gathering inside it. For families with little, this was the beginning of food. Not gold, not markets, not full storehouses. Just corn, beans, squash, fire, water, stone, clay, and knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Across many ancient communities of the Americas, these foods carried people through hard days. In some regions, corn stood tall in the field, beans climbed its stalks, and squash spread its broad leaves across the soil. But this story is not about one single people or one single place. It is about a pattern of survival that appeared in different forms among ancestral communities who knew how to make life from the simplest things. And when resources were scarce, every dish mattered. 20. Ash-roasted squash. The simplest meal may have begun without a pot at all. A piece of squash could be placed near the fire or buried carefully in hot ash. There was no need for much seasoning, no need for a carved bowl. The fire did the work slowly. The outer skin hardened and burned. Inside, the flesh turned soft, warm, and sweet. Imagine a child crouching near the hearth, smelling it before seeing it. The air carries smoke, earth, and the faint sweetness of the harvest. Someone pulls the squash from the ash with a stick. It is too hot to touch. They wait. Waiting is part of hunger. Waiting is part of cooking. When it is opened, steam rises into the cold air. For a poor household, this might not have been a side dish. It could have been the meal. A few bites for the youngest, a larger piece for someone who would walk far that day. Scraps for the old, seeds saved, perhaps dried, perhaps cracked later, because even what seemed small still had value. The squash was more than food. It was stored sunlight. It was the memory of a field, of a vine that survived insects, dry days, and sudden storms. To eat it was to receive one more day from the earth. 19. Plain corn mush. When the corn was too hard to chew, it had to be broken. Dry kernels could be crushed with stone, ground into coarse meal, then stirred into water. Over the fire, the mixture thickened. Slowly, patiently, it became mush, plain, heavy, and warm. There is no luxury in this bowl, no bright colors, no richness, just corn and water, moving under a wooden stick as someone stirs and stirs to keep it from burning. But for people who had worked since dawn, this simple food could calm the body. It filled the stomach. It gave strength to stand, to carry, to dig, to walk. The sound of stirring may have been one of the oldest sounds of home. In a hungry season, corn mush could be made thin, so more people could share it. In a better season, it could be thicker, almost firm, something that held together in the hand. It could feed a child before sleep. It could warm someone returning from the fields. It could be eaten quietly when there was nothing else to add. To modernize, it may seem plain, but plain food is not empty food. It is survival without decoration. It is the kind of meal that does not ask to be remembered, yet it keeps people alive long enough for memory to continue. 18. Boiled beans in a clay pot. Beans required patience. They were not food for the impatient fire. They were hard, dry, and stubborn. They had to be soaked, watched, boiled, and softened over time. In a clay pot with water and heat, the beans slowly changed. What began as small, hard seeds became a meal that could sustain the body. A poor family might not have had much to add. No rich meat, no heavy fat, perhaps only water, ash-cleaned corn, a little squash, or herbs if the season allowed. But beans brought something powerful, strength that lasted. They could turn a weak soup into a real meal. They could make a thin day feel less frightening. Picture the pot at the edge of the fire. The surface trembles. Steam escapes. Someone lifts the lid and checks the beans with a practiced eye. Not yet. More time. Time was one of the hidden ingredients of ancient cooking. The people who cooked this way understood that food was not always quick. Survival often meant beginning early, tending the fire carefully, and trusting slow transformation. The clay pot, blackened by smoke, became a quiet companion. It held water, heat, and hope. When the beans finally softened, the meal could be shared. Not in abundance, perhaps, but in dignity. 17. Cracked corn broth. Sometimes the food had to stretch. A small amount of cracked corn could be boiled in water until the liquid turned cloudy and warm. It was not a thick stew. It was not a feast. It was broth. Thin, simple, and honest. But even a broth could matter when the body was tired and the day was long. Cracked corn released its flavor slowly. The broken pieces floated, softened, and sank. Someone might drink the warm liquid first, then scrape the softened grain from the bottom of the pot. For the very young, the very old, or the sick, this kind of food may have been easier to swallow than whole kernels or heavy cakes. In the silence of a difficult season, a thin broth could be an act of care. It said, "There is little, but you will not be forgotten." That is the part we must remember. These dishes were not poor because the people lacked intelligence. They were simple because life demanded economy. Nothing wasted, nothing taken for granted. A cracked kernel, a cup of water, a coal kept alive through the night. Each one had meaning. Around the fire, hunger was not faced alone. Food moved from hand to hand, bowl to bowl, generation to generation. And even when the meal was small, the knowledge behind it was immense. 16. Three Sisters Stew. When the pot was large enough, and when the season had been kind enough, corn, beans, and squash could come together. The stew did not need to be beautiful to be important. It may have been thick, uneven, and smoky from the fire. Yellow corn, dark beans, soft orange squash breaking apart into the broth. Each ingredient carried its own memory of the field. The corn had stood upright, reaching for the sun. The beans had climbed and twisted, holding on with delicate strength. The squash had spread low across the ground, its leaves broad and protective, shading the soil beneath. In some regions, these crops were grown together, not as separate foods, but as companions. And when they entered the cooking pot, that relationship continued. A family gathered around such a stew would not have seen it as a modern recipe. They would have seen the work behind it. Someone had chosen the seeds. Someone had opened the earth. Someone had watched for birds, insects, drought, and frost. Someone had carried the harvest home. Someone had dried, stored, and protected it from dampness and animals. And now, after all of that, it became one warm bowl. The squash softened first, melting into the liquid and making it thicker. The beans gave weight. The corn gave texture, sweetness, and strength. Together they made a meal that could carry a person through cold, work, and worry. For poor families, this was not just cooking. It was balance. It was the wisdom of making different foods support one another, the way people in a household had to support one another when there was never quite enough. 15. Corn and bean pot. There were days when squash was gone. The last pieces had been eaten, the skins scraped clean, the seeds saved or roasted, and the storage place was empty except for corn and beans. On those days, the pot became simpler. Corn and beans. That was enough to begin. The beans had to go in first because they needed time. They softened slowly in the heat while the fire was fed carefully, never too large, never allowed to die. Later, corn could be added. Whole kernels, cracked kernels, or ground meal. The pot thickened. The smell changed. The meal became heavier. This kind of food belonged to working people. It could sit on the fire while other tasks continued. A woman could step away to grind more corn. A child could gather small sticks. An older man could mend a tool or check a basket. The pot stayed there, holding the center of the shelter, reminding everyone that food was coming, even if it came slowly. Corn and beans together made hunger less sharp. One filled the belly quickly, the other stayed with the body longer. Among many communities, combinations like this were not just convenient. They were part of a deeper understanding of nourishment, learned through long experience rather than written instruction. No one needed a book to know that a person who ate only thin broth would weaken. They knew by watching faces, shoulders, footsteps, and breath. A good meal showed itself in the way someone could work after eating, in the way a child stopped crying, in the way an elder's hands steadied around a warm bowl. 14. Squash and bean mash. When teeth were weak, when children were small, or when someone was ill, food had to be softened. Beans could be cooked until they nearly lost their shape. Squash could be roasted or boiled until it collapsed under the touch of a spoon or hand. Together, they could be mashed into a thick, gentle food. This dish asks us to slow down. There is no sharp sound of roasting kernels, no hard crust, no travel cake meant to be carried for days. This is food for the inside of a home. Food for someone sitting close to the wall, wrapped against the cold. Food for a grandmother whose chewing had become difficult. Food for a child still learning the taste of the earth. The mash would have been simple, but not careless. Someone had to judge the texture. Too watery, and it would not satisfy. Too thick, and the weakest could not eat it easily. The cook's knowledge lived in these small decisions. A little cooking liquid might be stirred back in. A few bits of corn might be added if there were enough. Squash brought sweetness. Beans brought depth. Together, they made something soft, warm, and human. In many ancient households, survival was not only about the strongest people enduring hardship. It was also about keeping the vulnerable alive. Infants, elders, the injured, the sick, those who could not gather food for themselves. A society can be remembered by its monuments, but it can also be remembered by its soft foods, by what it gave to those who could not bite. 13. Corn, bean, and squash winter soup. Winter changed everything. The fields were quiet. The vines were gone. The living green had withdrawn from the world, leaving behind only what people had saved with care. Dried corn hanging in bundles, beans stored in baskets or containers, squash kept in cool places as long as it would last. Smoke-darkened storage spaces, watchful eyes, careful hands. In winter, a soup made from these foods carried the memory of summer. The corn might be hard and dry. The beans might need long soaking. The squash, if still preserved, might be cut carefully, with every usable piece kept. If fresh squash was gone, dried pieces may have been used in some places, returning slowly to softness in hot water. The pot would steam while cold pressed against the walls. Outside, wind moved across the settlement. Footsteps were fewer. Work did not stop, but it changed. People repaired, carved, prepared, told stories, watched the sky, and counted what remained. Winter was not only a season of cold, it was a season of measurement. How much food is left? How many mouths? How many days until planting? This soup answered none of those questions completely, but it gave warmth. It gathered the stored harvest into one place. It reminded the family that the field had not vanished. It was still there, inside the pot, inside the seeds, inside the stories told while people ate. And perhaps, as the soup was shared, someone spoke of the coming spring. Not loudly, not with certainty, but with the quiet faith of people who had survived winters before. The first dishes were born from scarcity: a squash in ash, corn in water, beans softened by patience, a thin broth stretched as far as it could go. But when corn, beans, and squash came together, the meal became something larger than survival. It became memory organized into food. Every bowl carried a relationship between plant and soil, between fire and clay, between hunger and care, between the living and those who had taught them how to live. The people who made these meals did not need to call them ancient. They were simply doing what had to be done. But from a distance of centuries, we can see the quiet brilliance in it. Not abundance, not luxury, brilliance. 12. Ash-treated corn soup. There were forms of knowledge that lived so close to daily life they could almost disappear from view. A handful of corn, a little water, the gray softness of clean wood ash. To an outsider, it might have looked like nothing more than dirt and grain, but to the people who knew the process, it was transformation. In some regions, ancestral cooks treated corn with alkaline materials such as wood ash or lime. This could help loosen the tough outer hull of the kernel and change the food in ways that made it more useful to the body. It was not a laboratory discovery written on a tablet. It was practical knowledge, tested through generations, carried by observation, taste, health, and memory. Imagine the cook leaning over a vessel, watching the corn change. The kernels swell, Their skins loosen, the water clouds. The smell becomes earthy, warm, mineral, and deep. After washing and rubbing, the corn is no longer quite what it was before. It is softer, more willing to become soup, dough, or meal. For a poor household, this mattered. Hard corn could break teeth. Untreated grain could be difficult to prepare. But with ash, water, and patience, the same small store of corn became more flexible. It could become a soup that fed children. It could become a thicker meal for workers. It could become the beginning of another dish, another day, another chance. The soup made from this corn may have been plain, perhaps only kernels in broth, perhaps beans if there were enough, perhaps pieces of squash if the season allowed. But hidden inside that simple bowl was an ancient technology, quiet, careful, and deeply human. A person did not need wealth to possess wisdom. Sometimes wisdom looked like gray water and a hand rubbing corn beneath the morning light. 11. Stone-ground corn cakes. Before there was a cake, there was the sound of grinding. A stone met another stone. Corn cracked, then broke, then slowly turned into coarse meal. It was hard work, shoulder work, wrist work. Work that could begin before the sun rose and continue while children stirred, fires were built, and the settlement came awake. For many families, corn cakes were not delicate food. They were practical. The meal could be mixed with water into a rough dough shaped by hand and cooked on a heated stone near the coals or against a flat surface warmed by fire. The edges might darken, the center might stay dense and heavy. A cake like this could be eaten fresh when the steam still rose from its broken middle. Or it could be saved for later, wrapped, carried, and chewed during work. This was food with weight, not only physical weight, but emotional weight. Each cake held the labor of grinding. Every bite came from someone's time. Someone had sat or knelt and pushed grain across stone until the body ached. The cook could not separate food from effort. The meal remembered the work. A child might reach for a hot corn cake and be told to wait. An elder might break one in half and pass part of it to someone who had eaten less. A traveler might carry one into the morning, tucked away as protection against distance. In a world where hunger could arrive quickly, portable food was a kind of security. The cake was simple, but it could mean you will not walk empty. 10. Boiled cornbread. Not every bread was baked. Some corn mixtures could be shaped, wrapped, or dropped into boiling water, depending on the place, the tools, and the tradition. The result was not like modern bread. It was dense, moist, and filling, closer to a heavy dumpling or boiled loaf than something light and airy. For poor families, boiling had advantages. A pot could cook more than one thing. Corn dough might share heat with beans. Bits of squash might thicken the water. Nothing had to be wasted. Even the cooking liquid could carry flavor and strength. Picture a clay pot trembling over a low fire. The water is cloudy from corn. A hand lowers shaped pieces into the heat. They sink, then rise, then firm slowly. Around the pot, people wait with the practiced silence of those who know food cannot be rushed. Boiled cornbread was humble, but it answered a real need. It turned meal into something the hand could hold. It made corn feel more substantial. It could be shared in pieces. It could be placed beside beans, or dipped into broth. The beauty of such a dish was not in appearance, it was in usefulness. A poor household measured food differently. Could it fill the stomach? Could it be divided? Could it be carried? Could it feed the old and the young? Could it be made with what remained? Boiled cornbread could answer yes, and in that answer there was dignity. 9. Roasted corn kernels. Sometimes the fire gave food quickly. Dry corn kernels could be placed near heat, stirred in a vessel, or roasted until they hardened, darkened, or popped in small ways, depending on the type of corn and the method used. The sound would be different from boiling, sharper, livelier, a crack, a snap, a sudden movement in the pot. For children, roasted corn may have felt like a small gift. It was not a rich dessert. It was not an easy abundance. But it had texture. It had sound. It could be eaten by the handful if there was enough, or counted carefully if there was not. A few roasted kernels could travel well. They did not spill like soup. They did not spoil as quickly as soft food. They could be tucked away for a journey, a day in the fields, or a hungry hour between meals. The smell of roasted corn carried through the air differently than mush or stew. It was drier, warmer, almost nutty. It belonged to evenings when the fire burned low and someone wanted to make something from what was left. But even here there was caution. Too much heat and the kernels burned. Too little and they stayed hard. The cook had to listen, to stir, to know when the sound changed and when the food was ready. Ancient cooking was full of these small judgments, decisions made without clocks, thermometers, or written measures. The hands knew, the eyes knew, the nose knew. And the fire, if treated with respect, answered. There is something powerful in imagining these meals made with so few tools. A stone, a pot, a fire, a basket, a scraping tool, a pair of hands. From these came soups, cakes, breads, and roasted foods that could keep a family alive. Modern life often hides the labor inside food. It arrives already ground, cleaned, packed, measured, and named. But in the ancient home, every stage had a face. Someone remembered which wood made good ash. Someone knew which corn could be ground easily. Someone noticed when beans had soaked long enough. Someone taught a child where to place squash in the coals so it would soften without turning entirely to char. These were not small things. They were the architecture of survival. And for those with little, knowledge was often the greatest possession they had. 8. Dried corn and bean mix. There were days when the meal had to leave the hearth. Someone had to walk beyond the settlement. Someone had to work in distant fields, gather wood, follow a trail, visit relatives, trade, hunt, or carry news. The road did not wait for a warm pot. Hunger did not wait either. So food had to become lighter. Dried corn and beans could be carried together in a pouch or basket. They were not a finished dish in the way a steaming stew was finished. They were a promise, a small store of possibility. With water and fire, they could become soup. With grinding, they could become meal. With time, they could become something that restored a tired body. A traveler might carry parched corn, dried beans, or a mix prepared for later cooking. Each piece was hard, quiet, and plain. But in a world without shops, roads of stone, or easy supplies, such food was powerful. It meant a person could go farther from home and still return. Imagine someone leaving before dawn. The sky is pale. The fire behind them is still glowing. A small bundle hangs at their side. Inside it are the foods of the field, reduced to their most durable form. No bowl, no steam, no comfort, only endurance. This kind of food belonged to distance. It belonged to people who knew that survival was not always sitting by the fire. Sometimes survival was walking away from it, trusting that what you carried would be enough until you found water, shelter, and flame again. 7. Squash seed meal. Nothing from the squash needed to vanish without thought. The flesh could be roasted. The skin might be used, scraped, discarded, or sometimes serve as a vessel, depending on the situation. But the seeds were too valuable to ignore. They could be dried, roasted, cracked, or ground. In some homes, they may have been turned into a rough meal, a small but meaningful food made from what modern hands might throw away. The sound would be light at first, seeds shifting in a basket, dry and pale. Then came the harder sound of crushing, a stone pressing down, a hand moving in circles. Slowly, the seeds broke open and released their richness. Squash seed meal would not feed a whole village by itself, but poor kitchens are built from additions. A handful here, a spoonful there. Something stirred into broth, something sprinkled into mush, something mixed with corn to give a little more weight, a little more strength, a little more life. This is where ancient cooking becomes difficult to see from far away. Great monuments survive. Stone walls survive. Pottery fragments survive. But the careful decision to save seeds from a squash after a hungry meal, that disappears unless we imagine the person who made it. Someone sitting close to the fire, separating seed from stringy flesh. Someone drying them for later. Someone knowing that hunger often returns, and that every small store matters. For families with little, waste was not simply careless. Waste could be dangerous. So the seed became food. The shell became fuel, container, tool, or memory. The field was honored by using what it gave as completely as possible. 6. Corn cakes with bean paste. When there was enough corn to grind and enough beans to soften, the meal could become something more complete. A corn cake, warm from the stone, could be split open or folded around mashed beans. The beans might be plain, only softened and crushed. They might be thickened with a little cooking liquid. They might be mixed with bits of squash, if there was any left. The result was simple, but deeply practical. Grain and bean together, held in the hand. This was food for work. A person could eat it standing. A child could carry it outside. Someone returning from the fields could take it without waiting for a bowl. It was not elegant, but it was generous in the way useful food is generous. Imagine the cook pressing dough between palms. The surface is rough. The edges crack. The cake is placed near heat and watched carefully. Nearby, beans are mashed against the side of a vessel until they become thick and dark. Then the two are joined. Corn outside, beans inside. A small meal shaped by hand. For the poor, food often had to solve more than one problem. It had to satisfy hunger, but also save time. It had to be easy to divide. It had to be made from ingredients that could be stored. It had to work for children, workers, elders, and travelers. It had to be forgiving when the harvest was small. Corn cakes with bean paste did all of this. They carried the field in two forms, the tall plant and the climbing vine, the dry grain and the patient seed. Together they made something that could be eaten without ceremony, yet still carried the quiet intelligence of generations. 5. Thick bean and squash stew. As the day grew darker and the air cooled, the richest poor meal might be the one that thickened slowly at the bottom of the pot. Beans first, always the patient ones. They sat in water until the heat persuaded them to soften. Then squash could be added, its flesh breaking apart, turning the broth heavier and smoother. If there was corn, even a small amount, it could be stirred in to stretch the meal further. But even without it, beans and squash could make a stew that felt like comfort. This was not the food of display. It was the food of return. People came back from fields, from gathering, from carrying, from repairing, from watching children, from enduring the long pressure of ordinary life. Their bodies were tired in ways that did not need to be spoken. Around the pot, silence was not emptiness. It was relief. The stew thickened, the fire lowered. The smell of squash softened the sharper earthiness of beans. A wooden tool scraped the bottom so nothing burned. The cook knew how much water to add by sight, knew when the beans were ready by touch, knew how to make little feel like more. A thick stew changed the mood of a shelter. Thin soup could keep hunger away for a while, but thick stew gave the body confidence. It made people feel, even briefly, that the night could be faced, that tomorrow's work could be done, that the children might sleep. For ancient families living close to the edge of uncertainty, that feeling mattered. We often imagine survival as a dramatic moment, a storm, a battle, a long journey through danger. But much of survival was quieter. It was a pot that did not burn, a child fed before crying too long, an elder given the softest portion, a family stretching one handful of beans into something that could be shared. The beauty of these dishes was not only in their ingredients, it was in the care that arranged them. By now, the fire has become the center of the story. Not because fire was rare, but because everything depended on how it was used. Too much flame wasted fuel and ruined food. Too little left beans hard and corn stubborn. The cook lived between those extremes, reading heat the way others read tracks in dust or clouds above a field. Food for work, travel, and hunger was food shaped by necessity. It did not pretend life was easy. It did not hide scarcity. But it answered scarcity with skill. A dry pouch for the road, a seed saved from the squash, a cake folded around beans, a stew thick enough to bring peace to a tired room. These were not the meals of people without culture. They were the meals of people who understood the exact weight of a day. 4. Harvest pot, of corn, beans, and squash. After the harvest, if the season had not been too cruel, there could be a different kind of pot. Not a pot of wealth, not a feast in the way later cities would understand feasting, but a larger meal, made when the hands of the community had brought something back from the fields, and storage places were no longer empty. Corn was there first, dried or fresh, depending on the moment and region. Beans followed, dark and pale, small and strong. Squash came in heavy pieces, its flesh carrying sweetness from the sun. Together they filled the vessel, and the vessel filled the air with steam. A harvest pot was not only about taste, it was about breathing again. For months, people had watched the sky. Too much rain could damage the plants. Too little could leave them weak. Animals could enter the field. Insects could take what people needed. Early cold could punish a careless hope. The harvest was never guaranteed. So when food finally gathered in one place, the pot became a sign that the people had endured. Around it there may have been laughter. Not loud at first, perhaps. Hunger teaches people to be careful with joy. But slowly, as bowls were filled, shoulders loosened. Children came closer. Elders watched the young eat. Someone remembered who had planted a certain row. Someone spoke of a storm that almost ruined the crop. Someone said the beans had done well. Someone worried about winter anyway. Even in a good moment, ancient people knew not to forget danger. The harvest pot held that tension, gratitude and caution, relief and planning, fullness and memory. It was the same three foods, but now they carried a different emotion. Not desperation, not only survival. A brief abundance, modest and fragile, shining inside a clay vessel. For the poorest families, even this kind of meal may have been rare. But when it came, it reminded them that the earth could still answer. 3. Pumpkin shell stew. Sometimes the vessel itself could become part of the story. A large squash or pumpkin-like gourd, hollowed and cleaned, could serve as a container in certain cooking and serving traditions. We should be careful not to claim that every ancient community did this in the same way. Across the Americas, tools, crops, and cooking methods varied greatly. But the idea is easy to understand. When pottery was limited, when bowls were few, when people used what the field provided, the shell of a squash could become useful. Imagine the top cut away, the seeds removed and saved, the inside scraped. Into that hollow space go beans, corn, pieces of squash flesh, water, perhaps herbs from the local land, if available. The shell sits near heat, or the stew is prepared separately and placed inside for serving. Either way, the image carries a deep simplicity. Food held by the body of the plant that helped create it. There is something almost ceremonial in that, even when the meal is poor. The family does not need carved plates or polished vessels. The earth has already shaped one. The squash grew round under the sun, resting on soil, protected by leaves. Now it becomes bowl, memory, and meal. A child might stare into it, as if looking into a small world. The orange wall of the shell glowing in firelight. The dark beans floating. The yellow corn rising and sinking. Steam touching the face. In a household with little, beauty often came from usefulness. The curve of a pot, the woven pattern of a basket, the smoothness of a grinding stone shaped by years of work, the hollow shell of a squash still carrying the smell of the field. Pumpkin shell stew reminds us that poverty did not erase imagination. People made meaning with what they had. 2. Corn dumplings in bean broth. When the beans had cooked long enough, their broth became valuable. It held color, warmth, and strength. To throw it away would have been unthinkable in a hungry home. Into that broth, Small pieces of corn dough could be dropped. Dumplings, simple and dense, swelling as they cooked. The meal would have changed slowly. At first, only dark broth. Then, pale pieces of corn dough sinking beneath the surface. Then the water thickening, the dumplings firming, the smell becoming heavier. The cook might stir carefully so they did not break apart. A child might ask if they were ready. The answer would come from experience, not from time measured by numbers. Not yet. Soon. Now. Corn dumplings in bean broth were a clever answer to scarcity. Beans alone might not be enough. Corn cakes might be too dry. But together, in one pot, the broth flavored the dumplings, and the dumplings thickened the broth. Nothing stood alone. Everything helped something else. That was the lesson of many poor kitchens. A little corn improved the beans. A little bean broth improved the corn. A little squash softened the whole pot. A handful of seeds added richness. Ash changed grain. Stone changed kernels. Fire changed everything. The dish also carried tenderness. Dumplings are shaped one by one. Even if they are rough, even if they are uneven, they pass through the hand. Someone forms them. Someone lowers them into heat. Someone decides how many can be made from the meal that remains. In each dumpling, there is a question. How do we divide what we have? And in the sharing, there is an answer. Not perfectly, not always equally. Hunger makes fairness difficult. But the effort to share is itself a human act. A bowl passed across the fire can hold more than food. It can hold apology, duty, love, and the silent promise that no one will be ignored. 1. The poor family's three sisters' meal. At the end, the greatest dish is not the richest one. It is the bowl that gathers everything. Corn, beans, and squash. Perhaps all three in equal measure during a good season. Perhaps mostly corn, with only a few beans. Perhaps one last piece of squash scraped into the pot so the children can taste sweetness. There is no single recipe. There is only the ancient question every poor family has had to ask. What can we make from what remains? The answer, in many homes, was a meal like this. A small fire, a clay pot, water carried from a distance, corn broken by hand or stone, beans softened through patience, squash added when there was any left, steam rising into the dim room, faces turning toward the smell. This final bowl is not important because it is rare. It is important because it is ordinary. It may have been eaten after planting, when bodies were sore from bending over the earth. It may have been eaten during harvest, when hands were scratched and backs ached. It may have been eaten in winter, when people listened to the wind and counted their stores. It may have been given to children first. It may have been thinned when guests arrived. It may have been stretched when someone returned hungry from a journey. It was food, but it was also a record of relationships. Between people and plants, between elders and children, between hunger and knowledge, between the living and the ancestors whose names may never be known to us. We should not romanticize hardship. Hunger was real. Poverty was real. A failed crop could bring fear into every shelter. A small harvest could force impossible choices. Ancient life was not a beautiful painting of simplicity. It could be exhausting, uncertain, and dangerous. But we should also not mistake simplicity for emptiness. These meals carried intelligence. They carried observation. They carried chemistry learned through practice, agriculture learned through seasons, and cooking learned through hands. They carried the emotional labor of feeding others when there was not enough. The people who made them were farmers, gatherers, cooks, builders, parents, children, elders, travelers, and survivors. They were not defined by what they lacked. They were also defined by what they knew. As the night deepens, imagine the final scene. The pot is nearly empty. The fire has fallen low. A child sleeps, warmer now than before. An elder sits quietly, hands resting near the fading heat. Outside, the field is dark. The wind moves over the soil where the next seeds may one day be planted. Somewhere, carefully stored away, there is corn for grinding, beans for boiling, squash seeds for the ground. Not much, but enough to begin again. And that may be the deepest memory inside these 20 dishes. That survival was not only a matter of strength, it was a matter of care, patience, and the humble brilliance of people who knew how to turn the gifts of the earth into one more day of life.